Some fears don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with an explanation or name or any obvious origin. They just settle in, quietly, somewhere underneath everything else, and stay. And you learn to carry them the way you learn to carry any persistent weight, by adjusting, slightly, everything else around it. Natalie Wood was one of the most luminous presences in American cinema for more than 2 decades. She had begun as a child actress in the early 1940s and had made the rare and difficult transition to adult stardom, becoming in films like Splendor in the Grass, West Side Story, and Miracle on 34th Street, someone whose presence on screen carried genuine emotional weight. She was beautiful, yes, unmistakably so. But what people responded to was something else, a quality of feeling that came through clearly even when the film around her was less than it should have been. A sense that something real was happening inside her, and that the camera was simply recording it. What very few people knew, and what Natalie Wood spoke about only in private, and rarely even then, was that she carried with her for most of her life a significant fear of dark water. Not a casual discomfort, a genuine, deep, sometimes paralyzing fear that had no single clear origin story, though her mother had apparently told her in childhood that a dark body of water would claim her life, a warning that had settled into her body in ways she could not fully control or reason her way out of. This is notable for several reasons. One is that she appeared, in her professional life and in her public persona, entirely composed, graceful, confident, at ease in situations that would have undone most people. The fear was simply not visible. Not to most people who met her, not to most people who worked with her, not to the world that watched her on screen. She had learned, very early, how to carry private things without letting them show. It was a skill, and she was very good at it. People who were close to her described a woman who was, privately, more anxious than her public face suggested, more prone to worry, more in need of reassurance, more affected by uncertainty than the composed and radiant exterior would have indicated. The fear of water was perhaps the most visible manifestation of this, visible at least to those few who were with her near boats, or on the water, or in any situation that activated it. They described watching her face change in those moments, the composure slipping just slightly to reveal something older and less defended. She talked about wanting to deal with it, to understand it, to work through it, to arrive at some peace with a fear that had traveled with her for so long. She was, in the last years of her life, more open about her inner world generally, more willing to acknowledge the complexity underneath the surface, more interested in the kind of honest self-examination that had previously felt dangerous. There was a sense, from those who knew her in that period, that she was moving toward something, toward a fuller, more honest relationship with herself, toward the healing of things that had been carried a long time. Maybe you've been moving toward something like that, too. Maybe there is something in your own life, a fear, a wound, a piece of your history that has never quite been fully acknowledged, that you've been carrying for a long time without quite naming. Not necessarily a fear of something specific, like dark water. Maybe something more diffuse. A sense of being not quite enough, that settled in early and never entirely left. A pattern in your relationships that repeats in ways you don't fully understand. A tendency to pull back or to overextend, or to respond to certain situations with a feeling that seems too large for what's actually happening, as if something older than the current moment is being activated. These things, these patterns, these fears, these pieces of old history that have become current reality, respond to acknowledgement. Not always to resolution. Sometimes a fear that has lived in you for a very long time will not simply go away because you've identified where it came from. But naming it changes the relationship. It moves from something that operates on you, from underneath and unseen, to something you can stand next to and look at and say, "I see you. You've been here for a long time, and you don't have to run my whole life." That shift from unconscious carrying to conscious acknowledgement is often described by people who've made it as a kind of relief. Not the relief of the thing being gone, the relief of no longer having to pretend it isn't there, of being allowed to be a complete person, one who has fears and wounds and unresolved things, rather than a performance of someone who has everything in order. Natalie Wood was working toward that kind of honesty in her final years, more willing to let the fear be visible, at least to the people she trusted, more interested in understanding it than in simply managing it, more open, in general, to the idea that a life could be lived more fully if the things being carried were acknowledged rather than continuously suppressed. That kind of work, the quiet, private work of becoming more honest about what you carry, doesn't require a therapist necessarily, or any formal process, though those can help. It can begin with something much simpler, a few minutes of quiet in which you allow yourself to notice what's actually there. Not to solve it, not to explain it away, just to let it be present enough to be seen, to give it a name, even a tentative one, and to say to yourself, "I know you're here, and I'm going to stop pretending you aren't." The healing that comes from that acknowledgement is often slow. It rarely happens all at once, but it is real. And it tends to accumulate over time into something that feels, gradually, like more room inside yourself, more space for the rest of your life, for the joy, the connection, the genuine presence that becomes more available when you're not working so hard to keep something suppressed. Natalie Wood carried her fear her whole life. She didn't resolve it. But in her last years, she was moving toward it with more honesty than she had before, and the people who knew her in that period said she seemed, somehow, more fully herself, more present, more genuinely there, as if the honesty itself, even without resolution, was making room for her. Maybe the same is true for what you carry. Maybe you don't need to resolve it first. Maybe you just need to acknowledge it, to name it, clearly and gently, to yourself or to someone you trust, and to let that acknowledgement be the beginning of more room. So take a slow breath, and maybe, this week, let something you've been carrying a long time be a little more visible, at least to yourself. You don't have to fix it all at once. You just have to stop pretending it isn't there. That's always where the healing begins. There's one more dimension worth sitting with. Something about the difference between the fears and wounds we carry alone and the ones we carry with at least one other person who knows. Because one of the things that tends to keep old wounds active, circulating in the background, shaping behavior in ways we don't fully recognize, is the isolation. The fact that they are entirely private. That no one else knows this particular thing about you. That you have been managing it entirely on your own for a very long time. Shame tends to live in isolation. Not always. Some of what we carry isn't shame exactly, just the accumulated weight of unprocessed experience. But much of it has some component of shame attached. The sense that this particular thing, this fear, this wound, this pattern, is something that would make people think less of you if they knew. That it reveals something inadequate. That it is, in some way, evidence against you. Most of the time, this turns out not to be true. Not in the way we fear. Most of the things people are most ashamed of, most of what they've been managing alone for years, are things that, when finally shared with a person who can be trusted with them, are received with recognition rather than judgment. Because the person they told has something similar, or knows someone who does, or simply understands, from their own experience of being human, that having fears and wounds and unresolved things is not the exception, it's the rule. Sharing something you've been carrying alone doesn't have to mean sharing it with many people. Just one. Someone you trust enough to receive it without judgment. Someone whose response you can reasonably predict to be gentle rather than harsh. Someone who has, perhaps, shared something difficult with you in the past and been received well, which gives you some reason to believe the exchange can go both ways. Natalie Wood was moving, in her later years, toward more honest conversation with the people closest to her. More willing to let the fear be seen, at least in glimpses. More open to being known more fully than the polished public image would have permitted. And those who knew her in that period said it changed the quality of the relationships. That the honesty made the connections deeper. That being more fully seen, even in the difficult parts, made her feel less alone with those parts. Maybe that's available to you, too. Not necessarily a formal disclosure or a difficult conversation you've been avoiding. Just a moment of slightly more honesty with someone who is already close. A mention of something you've been carrying without telling them. A small movement toward being a little more fully known. The healing that comes from being known, genuinely known, including the difficult parts, is different from the healing that comes from working through something alone. Both are real. But the shared kind tends to stay differently, because it addresses not just the wound itself, but the isolation around it. The sense of being alone with something too heavy to carry indefinitely. And that isolation is often the most painful part. So take a slow breath, and maybe, this week, let something you've been carrying a long time be a little more visible, at least to one person who would be glad to know. You don't have to resolve it. You just have to let it be seen. That's always where the healing begins.